What's up, guys? I hope you're doing well. James here from jamesdforsythe.com. And if you haven't noticed, I like going over letters and some other small, I don't know if I'd say niche, but little aspects of history that are applicable to a very generalized topic or something like that. Just because I've noticed that as you kind of start to understand, as you start to understand a generalized concept, in this case, banking reform, specifically that led to the Federal Reserve System, um, going over these kind of smaller letters and sources, articles, and that stuff at the time, I've found has been really helpful in understanding general sentiment at the time. Also putting things in context. It makes it a lot easier, at least for me, to understand, why things went the way they did from a historical perspective. At least that's one thing that I've noticed for myself, because it really puts you in their shoes. Because if you think about it, and this is more of a generalized thought for studying history in general, is that, everything that you're learning and that sort of thing is from your context, right? You introduce your own biases, that sort of thing. And it's from what you know today at this point in time in the 21st century. So it is what it is. Even though this was quite literally it was about 110 years ago, I think exactly, not exactly, just over 110 years ago. Things are obviously much different now, and so being able to understand the events from that time from their perspective, I think is a huge edge that you can have in terms of understanding history in a way, and then also being able to try to translate that to now, because it's basically now that's all we have is the letters, and like from our perspective of now, all we have is this kind of what's going on now, general sentiment. We have the context, we just don't have the events just yet, or we don't have the advantage of retrospect, obviously. But with that being said, and not trying to get down to a separate topic, basically, I want to go over a short letter that Warburg wrote to one of his kind of critics in a way. Basically, this was a person by the name of J.H. Cowperthwait, and he basically had not necessarily criticizing Warburg, but basically giving an alternate point of view, kind of the one that we've been tearing apart for the power of regional reserve associations and that sort of thing. And Cowperthwait actually wrote they call it pamphlet. I was able to find part of it online. It's actually is kind of like a published kind of in a little book. Looks like it's less than 50 pages. Titled Separate Reserve Association, Non-Political Preventive of Financial Panic Suitable to All American Conditions, from 1912. And basically this paperback edition, it looks like it was published on September 10th, 2010. Right, so it looks like it's more of a historical kind of artifact thing. Right, doesn't seem to be some foundational kind of historical knowledge or whatever. But anyways, Cowperthwait originally published his article that turned into this pamphlet, I guess, in November of 1911. And then basically in January of 1912, Warburg responds to him through a letter, right? Because Cowperthwait sent Warburg his pamphlet, probably for, I don't know if it'd be advice or just kind of I've noticed this is one thing they did a lot in terms, I don't know if this is a general thing that they do for Congress or whatever, but whenever there's a major kind of reform movement, in a way it seems, basically it's anytime there's someone of kind of, I guess, decent stature. I don't know if that's the best way to put it. Someone who has a relative amount of importance in said field or experience in said field tends to, whatever content they create, to send it to the major representatives. In this case, not in this case, but in general, I've noticed a lot of the letters and pamphlets and stuff created for like the educational aspect and kind of, I guess, more academic interests in research in terms of banking reform from this time was sent to like Warburg or Aldrich and that sort of thing. So I don't know if that's like a common thing across in general. I guess it would make sense to me if it was, but regardless, basically with Warburg's retort to J.H. Cowperthwait, right? Mostly discussing again the topic of having separate reserve associations. So Warburg comes out directly and says he is frank to say that Cowperthwait has not shaken his conviction, which is that separate reserve associations will not prove successful, right? The whole having each reserve association or each regional reserve bank as we see them nowadays, or as we see them in the system now, being like their own central bank, having their own powers, their own reserves, and that sort of thing, right? And so he says the function of a reserve association to protect a country against gold withdrawals and other adverse effects cannot be carried out by separate associations, which would not, as you point out yourself, you being Cowperthwait, Warburg's talking to Cowperthwait, have the same point of view, nor be governed by the same conditions at the same time. The accumulation of foreign exchange and its resale at a given moment could not be carried out by scattered associations. There must be one large and single point of view and cooperation by all for the benefit of all if the plan is to succeed. Again, basically, when you're talking, especially with foreign countries, and in this case he brings up gold withdrawals. At the time, remember, we were on the gold standard. This was before FDR, and we kind of went to more of the gold exchange standard. So it was more fractional reserve banking back then, because this is before even like the euro dollar system and all that stuff started happening, again, 1912. But yeah, so kind of putting that into context. Basically, he's saying, like, if they're competing with one another, you completely defeat the purpose of having of this reform in general. The whole purpose was to prevent the to prevent the hoarding of reserves and to have the centralization of reserves so that they could go where they're needed throughout the entire sovereign banking system that they need or that they have, right? And so he says, if you leave cooperation between the scattered associations indefinite and loose, you will have a scramble for reserves in times of need and a gold premium between those various centers in case of crisis. And you will not have a united front in facing the enemy at home and abroad. Again, basically, like, I guess the whole divided we fall, united we stand kind of idea, but he's just putting it with respect to the banking system. And one of the things that kind of clicked for me when I was reading this letter itself is really thinking about the powers and stuff, the topic of the past few videos. And so with the idea of this new banking reform, right, was in terms of the reserves, they need to be centralized. But in terms of like the powers and that sort of thing, they should be decentralized and independent across the region. So basically having all the regions have centralized reserves in one system, incorporating all of the regional banks. But each region has their own kind of independent operations, right? Like I've talked about in previous videos with like the discount rate, right? And I talked more in depth back then in the previous video about that specifically. So I'm just kind of cite that one because that was a few minutes long. But one thing to notice is, again, this letter that Warburg wrote to Cowperthwait was in early 1912. And by this time, regional plans were pretty common. It seemed like that was kind of the general consensus of where they were wanting to go, was having a regional plan to some extent. And then to keep in mind that after this, only about a month or so, almost exactly a month after it. So this letter was dated January 12th, 1912. And then basically Warburg presented on February 19th of the same year to the Republican Club of the City of New York, kind of publicly expressing his opinions on this, right? And kind of to conclude and also to kind of bring it all together. So the facts that are related here for the purpose of showing how obvious it was, long before the preparation of the first draft of the Glass Bill was begun, that disconnected regional reserves could not accomplish the desired end, and that, if they were satisfactorily tied together, a central banking system would result. So kind of the difference between... So the whole centralization of reserves is necessary from his point of view, right? And basically, regardless of how you kind of want to put lipstick on it or whatever, it's going to be like a central banking system, right? Because that's kind of the whole point. Regardless. But yeah, I don't know. I'm probably just going to leave this one here. If you guys have any comments or concerns, because I can't think of anything at the moment to add that I haven't already stated either in this video or the previous few, because they've been kind of attacking the same concept from different angles, using different sources in terms of letters and articles and that sort of thing. But regardless, a lot of the times, and what I use as kind of a basis for these kind of videos is Paul Warburg's book itself. So Federal Reserve System, its origins and growth. It's the boat anchor one that's like 800, 900 pages. See if I can see. It's exactly before the index, if I can get to it. So 826 pages, excluding the index and that sort of thing. But yeah. And I always put like the links to the books that I'm using or to the articles or whatever in the description, so you guys can find it as well. This is, I've noticed, has been one of the foundational pieces, which is kind of why I've been combing through it rather extensively for these videos and stuff, because I've noticed pretty much any major work about the Federal Reserve's history or the Federal Reserve in general cites this book to some extent, even once holding the opposite point of view. And I go over this, and I said this explicitly when I did a book review on Murray and Rothbard's book, The Federal Reserve. That's this one. It's like The Origins of the Federal Reserve and Its History, or I forget the exact title, but it's a smaller book, kind of more like a pamphlet from Murray and Rothbard, not one of his bigger ones on the history of American banking in general. But yeah, basically I've been using this one because it's cited so much. It seems to be very foundational, that sort of thing, in terms of not just the Federal Reserve System, but also kind of the history of banking in general, and also kind of the, I guess, theology, the theory behind banking reform and that sort of thing. And Warburg is known, I've noticed throughout history, as being kind of one of the more educated bankers on terms of the theory of banking in general. And I've heard that cited from a few sources. So, that being said, I'm going to leave this one here. So, I hope you guys have a good night, and I will see you on the next one.